Well, hello, cutie. I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and a collector of books like me. Today's book is The Odd Sisters, and it is book 6 in the Villains series by Serena Valentino. And if you're not familiar with the Villains series, you might be kind of lost during this video. So if you want to get caught up, I will link the videos to the other books in this series that I have done so that you'll know what's going on. Also, spoiler alerts, if you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch this video. I will be summarizing the book. I don't go into everything because there isn't much time. These videos are already very long. But I will be summarizing it and you will know the ending. All right, yeah, so if you want to know how I did this look and you want to hear the story of the Odd Sisters, stay tuned. Okay, so The Odd Sisters by Serena Valentino, and this book came out in 2019. Now this book was a little bit different from all the rest in this series. There's actually illustrations inside and they're really beautiful. When you first open the book, there is a map of the mini kingdoms, so you can see how everything is related to each other geographically. And then there is the mini royal families, family trees, so you can see how everyone is related to each other. And these actually really helped out keeping the story straight. But yeah, then throughout the book, there's an illustration at the beginning of each chapter. Anyways, that was a little different about this book. If you are curious about any of the products that I'm using, they will be listed in the description below. So this book starts out with Circe narrating, and remember, she's the enchantress from the beginning of Beauty and the Beast, and she's giving a summary of everything that's happened in the series so far. And she says that her mothers, Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha, are very odd, and they're sisters. In fact, they're identical triplets. Now, Circe says that her mothers had disappointed her when she realized how destructive and cruel that they really were. But of course, she still loved them. They were her mothers. And through reading their journals, she realized that they were the most powerful witches that lived, except for one, Circe herself. Now, the Odd Sisters had a younger sister named Circe, but she had died when Maleficent destroyed the fairylands, which I didn't catch that part in the Maleficent book. But anyways, Maleficent didn't know that she had killed Circe, and Lucinda, Ruby, and Martha were so desperate to get their little sister back that they used a spell that took the best parts of themselves and created a new Circe, the Circe that was now speaking. So she was no longer their little sister, but their daughter, a daughter created from magic and love. And her mothers would do anything to protect her, and they did. They wreaked havoc and chaos throughout the many kingdoms, all in the name of protecting her. Now, Circe's whole life, she had thought that they were her sisters that were forced to raise her after something terrible happened to their parents, though they never told her what. They just told her that, they were protecting her from a painful truth. And that truth was that they were her mothers, not her sisters. The odd sisters taught Circe their magic, which helped Circe to thrive. From a young age, she could do magic that even older witches couldn't do. She was very gifted, and her magic was even stronger than the odd sisters. It wasn't until Circe had fallen in love with the Beast Prince that her mother's true nature came out. Their overprotectiveness became brutal. The prince had broken Circe's heart, and the odd sisters wanted revenge on him. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. They convinced Circe to partake in a ruse that they said would prove to Circe that he didn't really love her, but Circe believed that he did. So she went along with it, thinking he would prove them wrong. But he ended up reacting exactly as the odd sisters predicted that he would. He was cruel and vile to Circe and withdrew his love from her. So Circe ended up cursing him, which is what we see at the beginning of the Beauty and the Beast movie. But Circe had given him a chance to redeem himself if he could find and receive love. But the odd sisters had other ideas. They decided to drive him mad until he became the disgusting beast that they knew him to be. And all of this Circe could have forgiven if they hadn't involved Princess Morningstar and Belle. And this was just the beginning of Circe's disappointment in her mothers. She was so angry at them for putting Tulip's and Belle's lives in danger that she hid from them, punishing them by withdrawing her love. She was thinking that this would motivate them into changing their ways. Now, frantic, the odd sisters went to Ursula for help, who was a very powerful witch, and they asked her to help them find Circe. But little did they know that Ursula had actually kidnapped Circe and put Circe in her garden of lost souls. So Ursula again agreed to help the odd sisters find Circe in exchange for them helping her dethrone King Triton. And this whole time, she actually had Circe. Maleficent was her mother's lifelong friend, and Maleficent had warned the odd sisters not to get involved with such a power-hungry witch as Ursula. But of course, they didn't listen. They were blinded by their obsession in finding Circe, so they went along with Ursula's mad plan. And again, all of this Circe could have forgiven if her mothers hadn't tried to kill Ariel in the whole situation. Now, once her mothers found out what Ursula had done, kidnapping Circe and hiding her in her garden of souls, they became enraged, and they ended up reversing the spell that they had created to take down Triton and kill him, and they used it to kill Ursula instead. But they hadn't really anticipated what that was going to do to their own bodies. It left them passed out and lifeless on the floor of Morningstar Castle. But their souls were trapped in the dreamscape, and that's where they still were. Then Maleficent, having felt the power of this spell go out into the world, traveled to Morningstar Castle because she needed to find someone who was very powerful to help her bind a spell to keep Prince Philip from waking up Princess Aurora, her own daughter. Now this curse, this sleeping curse that she had put on Aurora, was going to be taking effect soon on her 16th birthday. Maleficent had placed this curse on her daughter Aurora because she feared that Aurora would have the same powers as her, and that just like her, she would someday lose control of them and destroy everything and everyone, just like Maleficent had on her 16th birthday. Circe found out that her mothers had helped to create Aurora for Maleficent, which would be Maleficent's ruin, just like it had been her mother's ruins, since they created Circe in the same fashion as they had helped Maleficent do. So Circe decided that she was going to use her magic to keep her mother's souls in the dreamscape, at least until she figured out what to do about them. Besides, she was still pretty busy trying to clean up all their messes. So all she asked of them was to just sit and be quiet, and not meddle, and just take it easy in the dreamscape. But of course, they couldn't be content with just waiting. This time they meddled in Gothel's life. Gothel had been a childhood friend of theirs who grew up in the dead woods with her sisters Primrose and Hazel, and her mother Manya, who was a very powerful witch and was the queen of the dead. Now, through Gothel's story, Circe learned the true nature of her mothers. Before they had lost their little sister, the girl that Circe used to be, they were actually pretty normal and had the capacity for friendships and love. But once they had created Circe, something in them changed, and the magic that they had used had kind of started to drive them mad. I don't know what is going on with my bangs today. I'm weird. I think I used too much leave-in conditioner. They had made promises to Gothel that they didn't intend to keep. Their plan was to steal her magic Rapunzel flower. They were going to use it on Maleficent to restore her from the effects that the spell that they had made to create Aurora had on her. Circe caught them meddling once again, and this really made her mad. Circe had it with their destructive ways, and she actually noticed a little bit of a pattern with her mothers. She noticed that whoever got in their way was met with destruction. And Circe wanted to forgive them. I mean, who wouldn't do anything to protect their child? But she couldn't forgive them for not having empathy for those who had just simply gotten in the way. People like Belle and Princess Tulip Morningstar and Snow White, and how they hated Snow White. They had given Grimhilda, Snow's stepmother, a magic mirror with her own father's soul trapped inside, and encouraged her to kill her own daughter, Snow White. And they still were not satisfied. They still hated Snow White and had continued to torment Snow White in her dreams even to this day, but yet nobody still knew why exactly. Now, since all of this, Snow White and Circe had grown close. They were cousins, and they had a lot in common. Snow was burdened with the task of continually having to make her mother feel better about all the terrible things she had done, as so was Circe, burdened with the treachery of her own mother's terrible deeds. And finding each other had been a real gift to Circe. It made her feel stronger having Snow by her side while she went around trying to fix all these issues that her mothers had created. So this story is just as much about Circe as it is her mothers. Their fates were all woven together through blood. And Circe was wondering what she should do next. Should she leave her mothers in the dreamscape to punish them, or should she let them loose and risk them continuing to wreak havoc on the mini kingdoms? But Cersei, deep down, she kind of already knows the answer. She knows what she must do. She just is having a hard time finding the courage to do it. Now, in the dreamscape where the Odd Sisters were trapped, Cersei had turned all their mirrors black. The mirrors in their chamber was how they saw what was going on in the mini kingdoms. And Cersei had done this as a punishment for what they had done to Gothel and Maleficent and Ursula and the Evil Queen. And the Odd Sisters were kind of afraid that Cersei was never going to forgive them. Now, Lucinda especially wanted revenge. She wanted revenge on everyone who had taken Cersei away from them. She wanted to destroy everyone that Cersei held dear. That way, the only people left in her life would be the Odd Sisters. But in order to do this, she needed to resurrect Maleficent so that she, in her dragon form, could help the Odd Sisters fight the fairies, the ones that the Odd Sisters felt had stolen Cersei from them. At least that's how they saw it. And Lucinda had been keeping a secret from her sisters and from Cersei their entire lives. It was such a big secret that if any of them found out, it would destroy all of their lives. And that was actually the main reason that Lucinda wanted out of the dreamscape. She needed to get to Gothel's library and destroy it, because that is where the answer to the secret laid. Now, inside the dreamscape, Grimhilda's face suddenly appeared in their mirrors, the ones that surrounded their chamber. And the Odd Sisters had become afraid because they thought she was there for revenge on them for having trapped her soul in the mirror. But she wasn't. She was actually there because she needed their help with something. She needed help getting Snow White back. Snow White had been off with Cersei for quite some time, and Grimhilda felt that Cersei had taken Snow White from her. All the women in these stories are very possessive of each other. Anyway, she wanted a spell from them to bind Snow White to her, and she was willing to do anything in exchange for it. Now, what they wanted from Grimhilda was for her to find one of Maleficent's crows, the one that was named Opal. Opal had been missing for a very long time, and the Wicked Queen agreed. Now, if you remember from the last book, Cersei and Snow White, they had been trapped in the Odd Sisters' house in some other dimension. It was called the Beginning. Now, the house had finally traveled back to the mini kingdoms, and Cersei and Snow White were very happy to be home. They weren't even really sure why the house had traveled to the Beginning in the first place, except that maybe it was some kind of a fail-safe in case anything had ever happened to the Odd Sisters. And while they had been in the house that whole time, they had been reading from the book of fairy tales that Snow had gotten as a child from the Odd Sisters. And in fact, they kind of suspected that the Odd Sisters may have actually written this book. When they got back to Morningstar Castle from the Beginning, Cersei was a little concerned for Snow White's safety. Her mothers were still inside Morningstar Castle, passed out on the floor. But Cersei was concerned that if they woke up and found out that Snow White was there, they might try to harm her. So before Cersei went back to Morningstar Castle, her and Snow White decided to have some tea. And while they were having their tea, Cersei looks over at Snow White and she's like, you know, that teacup that you're drinking from used to be yours. And Snow White takes a closer look at it. She's like, you know what, I thought so. I'm guessing, you know, your mothers stole it from my parents years ago. And Cersei was like, yeah, I know. She's like, I'm still kind of trying to figure out what they were doing with all these teacups. Were they from, you know, from different people? As we've seen throughout this series, they tend to slip into their purses from time to time. Anyway, Cersei couldn't figure out if they were just some kind of trophy of their misdeeds or there was something, you know, more sinister behind it. Cersei decided she needed to head back to Morningstar Castle, but before she left, she put an enchantment on the house so that nobody could enter who wanted to harm Snow White, since Snow White was going to be staying in the house. And because, you know, Snow White was still, you know, kind of pretty scared of her mother and definitely scared of the Odd Sisters. Now, on Cersei's way to Morningstar Castle, she ran into Flanzy. Remember Flanzy, the telepathic cat that was a little bit of a witch herself? She runs into her and she's so happy to see her, but Flanzy doesn't seem as happy to see Cersei. Flanzy said that she was very disappointed that Cersei had betrayed her mothers after everything her mothers had done for her. Flanzy is like, you know, I have known your mothers for a very long time, even before you came into being. She was like, I saw what they went through to bring you back, and if there's nothing good left in them, that's because they gave it all to you. And this like really hurt Cersei. Then Cersei asked Flanzy, she was like, do you know why my mothers hate Snow White so much? And Flanzy was like, oh yeah. She was like, it was never about Grimhilda. They always hated that little brat. And Cersei was like, call her that. And Flanzy was like, if you really want to know, you're gonna have to look it up in your mother's journal. And then Flanzy just like walked off back to sit with her mistresses in Morningstar Castle, leaving Cersei behind kind of confused and very hurt. When she got back to the castle, the fairy godmother and Nanny, her sister, were there. So Nanny received a message from Oberon, the tree lord and king of the fairies, that he had reason to believe that the Odd Sisters were trying to lure Maleficent back from the other side of the veil to help them in fighting against him and the fairies. And this was very distressing news. So Nanny and the fairy godmother and Cersei all go into the garden to have some tea and discuss, because everything is always better with tea. So the first thing that they decided they needed to do was to check on Cersei's mothers in the dreamscape. So Cersei takes out her enchanted hand mirror and she says into it, she says, show me the Odd Sisters. But instead of it showing the Odd Sisters, it showed a different familiar face. It was Grimhilda. And Nanny was like, what do you want, you witch? And Grimhilda was like, well, my daughter, of course. She's like, I know you guys have her, and I'm going to rain terror upon your heads until you return her. And then she disappeared from the mirror. Then Cersei uses her enchanted hand mirror to call on Snow White and check on her. And when Snow answers, she's like, oh yeah, I'm fine. She's like, I've just been sitting here reading from the book of fairy tales. I've been going over Gothel's story again. And there was something that she really wanted to show Cersei. So she runs to get the book and she turns to the pages that she had wanted to show her, but now they were gone. And Snow asked Cersei, she's like, what do you think that means? And Cersei had no idea. So Snow White tells Cersei, she's like, oh, no, don't worry about it. You're really busy right now dealing with your mothers. She's like, I'll figure this out on my own. So after this little conversation with Snow White, she returns to tea with the fairy godmother and nanny. And the two of them, they had to break the news to Cersei that the fairy council was going to be putting her mothers on trial for all their terrible deeds. The council needed to decide what the consequences were going to be for them. But Cersei was concerned more about her mother's escaping from the dreamscape and figuring out a way to resurrect Maleficent and then using her to fight against the fairies. So Nanny decided that her and the fairy godmother, they would go to the trial in her place while Cersei figured out how to keep her mothers from escaping. Now back at the Odd Sisters' house where Snow White was, Snow White had been thinking a lot about Gothel's story. And she had always wondered, like, how did the Odd Sisters end up being able to even get into the Dead Woods, since Manya had enchanted the boundary and people couldn't come and go from the Dead Woods. So she goes back and starts looking through the Book of Fairy Tales. But when she's looking, she comes upon a story that she hadn't seen before called The Mourning Box. So this is the story of the Mourning Box. And it's mourning like sad, not mourning like, sunshine and birds chirping. So deep within a dead forest lived a family of witches, and the boundaries of the dead forest was enchanted in order to keep the living out and the dead in. There were 3 witches who lived there. One was Manya, with her mother, who was the dreaded Nestes and current queen of the dead. And the third was a little baby that Manya had just given birth to. The current queen of the dead loved her daughter very much, and she was preparing her for the day that she would take over as queen of the dead. Nestes had also foreseen that her daughter Manya would give birth to a very powerful witch. Once her daughter Manya did give birth to this little witch, Nestes wanted more. She wanted 3. Now, if you remember from past stories, witches who are triplets are very favored amongst the gods because they are more powerful than normal witches. Nestes told Manya that they would split her daughter into 3 to make them more powerful. And Manya's like, split them in 3? She's like, what do you mean? She's like, that doesn't even make sense. She's like, if you split her into 3, won't each be less powerful than if she were just 1? Because you have to split her magic between 3. And Nestes is like, not with my blood, they won't. And Manya's like, but she's already perfect just as she is. She's like, Mother, please don't do this. And Nestes says to Manya, she's like, don't you see how legendary they will be? She's like, no harm will come to them. And think how favored we will be among our ancestors and the gods. She's like, there's nothing beyond our reach once they are 3. And Manya's like, are you saying that you want to extend our reign beyond the Dead Woods? No witch has ever crossed the border. And Nestes is like, do not presume to tell me our family history. She's like, besides, I've already discussed it with the ancestors and I have their permission. Now Manya, upset, left with her baby, and she went to the altar of their ancestors. She opened up a little wooden box and she lit the candle that was inside it. Then she says, ancestors, please forgive me for disturbing you while you're in the mists. but I'm concerned with your plans for my daughter. And then Manya hears a voice say, "Oh, Manya, we are very pleased with the birth of your daughter." Then Manya asked them, she's like, have you given her permission to split my daughter into 3? And the ancestors were like, well, she doesn't need our permission to strengthen the line. And then Manya was like, well, did you give her permission to extend our reign beyond the dead woods? And that, the ancestors were like, oh, no. And they're like, but don't worry. They're like, we won't let that happen. And don't worry, we'll protect your baby. And Manya said, bless you. And then she blew out the candle. Then her beloved Jacob came into the room. And right behind him was Nesties. And Nesties is like, were you just talking to the ancestors? And Manya was like, oh, yes. She's like, I wanted them to bless my daughter. And Nesties was like, you lie. And she used her magic to fling Manya across the room. And she crashed into the ancestors' altar and broke the mourning box. Manya gathered up all her courage and made her way over to her baby, who was lying in her bassinet. And Nesty screams at her. She's like, give me the child. And Manya's like, never, I'll never give you my daughter. And Nesties is like, well, okay, fine. If you won't give me your daughter, then I'm going to kill your beloved. And again, Manya's like, I will never give you my daughter. And Nesties is like, okay, well, that's your choice then. You'd rather see the father of your child die than hand her over to me. That's fine. And Manya lies again, and she's just like, oh, he's not the father. She's like, my baby was born of magic, just like all the witches of the dead woods. But Nesties knew. She's like, lies again. Nesties is like, give me your child or I'm going to slit his throat right in front of you. But Manya could not do that, not even for her beloved. She couldn't hand over her child to someone who might harm it. And so, holding her baby, she looks at Jacob, her beloved, and she says, I'm sorry. She just closes her eyes. Now remember, Snow White is reading all of this in the book of fairy tales. And when she gets to this part, it ends. And there are missing pages. Snow White wanted so badly to call Cersei and let her know what she had found. But she also didn't want to bother her since Cersei was dealing with a lot right now. And then all of a sudden, Snow White, she felt a little faint, like she needed some air. So she stood up and opened the front door to go outside. But sitting on the doorstep was a shiny red apple. And it scared Snow White. Was her stepmother back to get her? She screamed. And then Cersei did show up on an enchanted mirror that was hanging on the wall. So when Cersei found out what had happened, her and Nanny rushed over to the Odd Sisters' house before Nanny had to go to the Fairylands and the Fairy Council meeting. But they determined that the apple was not poisonous, it wasn't enchanted, it couldn't harm Snow White, it was just left there to scare her, but who would do that? Now while Nanny was there, she's like, you know what, while I'm here, I want to check on something. She starts rummaging through their kitchen cabinets. She pulls out a teacup. She's like, I thought so. I thought they had stolen a teacup from me when they had visited me for the fairy exams. And Nanny decided she was going to take it back, at least until she figured out what their purpose was in having her teacup. Then Snow White suggested that her and Cersei go and check on Mrs. Tittlebottom. Remember Mrs. Tittlebottom from the last book and her silly name? Snow White thought they should go and check on her since she was quite old now and didn't have a family anymore. But also Snow White had another motive in suggesting this. Now Snow White really wanted to go to Mrs. Tittlebottom's because she wanted to look through Gothel's library that was still at Mrs. Tittlebottom's house for those missing pages. So Cersei and Snow White, they flew the Odd Sisters' house back to the flower field where Mrs. Tittlebottom's cottage still was. Inside the house, Mrs. Tittlebottom told them that Hazel and Primrose had woken up and decided to go home. Remember, Primrose and Hazel, Gothel's sisters, had died and their bodies had been preserved in the cellar because Gothel had wanted to try to resurrect them. Anyway, they had woken up out of nowhere and just like went back home. And Cersei and Snow White are shocked. They're like, how did that happen? And Mrs. Tittlebottom told them that, oh, well, because of all the magic Rapunzel flowers. Didn't you see them when you came inside? And they go to the window, they look outside, and they see all these glowing lights coming from the flower fields that were filled with magical Rapunzel flowers. And Cersei and Snow White are like, where did all these magic Rapunzel flowers come from? And Mrs. Tittlebottom was like, well, where all flowers come from, they grew. Then Nanny and the fairy godmother got to the fairylands in the fairy council meeting. And right before the meeting started, the fairy godmother got a message from Oberon saying that he had found out that the Odd Sisters had woken up, they had escaped the dreamscape and had woken up at Morningstar Castle and just got up and left. And Nanny's like, well, how did this happen? She's like, nobody's powerful enough to break the fairy magic that was keeping them there. And then she's thinking, she's like, you know what? There's only one creature so loyal to them that they would risk everything, and that was Flanzy. Now back to Cersei and Snow White at Mrs. Tittlebottom's. They were confused on how the flowers had brought Hazel and Primrose back to life, just as Gothel had always wanted. They had just woken up and ventured off to the dead woods alone. And Snow White and Cersei were worried about what would happen once they got there and saw that their home had been destroyed and found out that their sister was dead. I mean, they didn't have any knowledge of the events that had happened after they died. So they decided to go after them, packing up the books from Gothel's library that Snow had wanted. Now, as they were packing up Gothel's books, Cersei got a call on her magic hand mirror from Nanny and told her that they had found out that her mothers had escaped from the dreamscape and that Flanzy had been the one to help them. And they knew, they had confirmed that it was Flanzy because her body was laying motionless on the floor where her mother's bodies had once been after they used their magic to destroy Ursula. And Cersei told Nanny that, you know, after they were done dealing with the issues in the dead woods, that they would be coming back to help. Now, Cersei and Snow White were pretty worried about this. If her mothers had gotten out of the dreamscape, they were pretty worried about that. They were both in danger. But Cersei, you know, she knew that she would be able to handle herself against the Odd Sisters if need be, but not Snow White. Snow White didn't know magic. So Cersei gave her a locket to wear that would protect her. Now, as they were leaving and saying goodbye to Mrs. Tittlebottom, she had a little bit of advice for Cersei and Snow White. She told them that, you know, she can smell a fairy tale when one is going on. And she told them that, you know, my story has come to its end, but I have a feeling that yours is just beginning. She's like, and whatever you do, don't get caught up in someone else's story. Stick to your own story. write your own ending. Then their house rose up into the sky and they waved goodbye to Mrs. Tittlebottom. Now by this time, the Odd sisters were waking up, and Lucinda opens her eyes and she sees where they are. They had been ripped from the dreamscape, but Lucinda knew exactly where they were. They were in the place between. And it was the place between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Lucinda knew this because they had been there before. Now, the Odd sisters had kind of expected to see Maleficent there. They had always told her that if she died, to wait there for them and they would bring her back. She wasn't there. They did, however, see some of her crows, and they had hoped to find Opal among them, but they didn't. Now, Circe and Snow White had arrived at the Dead Woods in the Odd Sisters' house, and Snow asked Circe, she's like, how is it that we're able to cross the boundaries? I thought that, the boundaries were enchanted and no one could get in or out. And Circe wasn't totally sure, but she kind of assumed that it was because whatever enchantments there were died with the last of the witches that ruled there. Then Snow White and Circe parted ways after they landed the house. Snow White was going to go into the mansion, or what was still left of it, and go through their library to see what she could find of any missing pages that might be there that went in her fairy tale book. And Circe went to go look for Sir Jacob, if he was still around, if he had survived that whole time. And as she was looking for Sir Jacob, she came upon two women that were standing right in front of Hazel and Primrose's crypts. And simultaneously, they turned their heads and looked at Circe, and they were both like, "Oh, you must be Circe." And Circe's like, "How do you know who I am?" And the sisters were like, "Oh, we know everything about you. In fact, we know everything." She's like, "Since we've died, we've been in the place between. And in the place between, you can hear everything." And Circe was like, "Oh," she's like, "Okay, well, would you like to go and meet Snow White? She's actually in your library right now looking for some kind of missing pages to a story that she thinks is important." Now, on their way to the library, they ran into Sir Jacob. He had survived. And he's like, "Oh, so the one made of three has come to the Dead Woods." And Primrose and Hazel are like, "Yeah, she's here because she's looking for answers about her mothers, and I think it's time that she knows the truth." When they got to the house, Sir Jacob asked Snow White what story that she was looking for. Circe had told him, everything that was going on their way back to the house. And Snow White told him, she's like, it was actually a story involving you and Manya called The Morning Box. Now Jacob, he pulls some papers out from his jacket and he's like, it's probably these. He gives them to Snow White and she matches them in the Book of Fairy Tales. She looks at Circe and she's like, you might want to read the beginning of this story really quick before we get into these other pages, or you're not going to know what's going on. So Circe, she reads it real quick, and then she looks at Jacob and she's like, "Who took these pages out?" And Jacob was like, "Well, I did." He was like, "I was trying to protect my little witch Gothel." So Snow looks at Jacob and she's like, "I thought the Book of Fairy Tales had belonged to the Odd Sisters." She's like, "How did you end up with it?" And he's like, "Well, it does belong to the Odd Sisters, but it didn't always." So then together they read the rest of the Morning Box. And this is the rest of the story. Manya had betrayed her greatest love to protect her daughter. But then her mother was going to do what she wanted with the baby anyway. Nesties left with the baby and left Manya in the nursery, numb from pain and sorrow. Then a couple minions showed up and took Jacob's body away. Later, Nesties returned, holding a baby, and she also had 2 of her little skeleton minions with her, one on each side, and each of them was holding a baby. And Nesties says to Manya, she's like, "Behold, your daughters, aren't they perfect?" And Manya asks Nesties, she's like, "What will become of my daughter, my real daughter?" And Nesties is like, "Well, they will bring darkness to the world. Their murder ballads will be heard in the many kingdoms." I like that. Murder ballads. Now Manya couldn't tell the 3 of the babies apart. She's like, "Which one is mine? Which one is my Lucinda?" And Nesties is like, "They're all your daughters." Now 2 of the babies start crying, but one isn't. And Manya, she just knows that this is the one that's not crying. This is her actual daughter. This is her Lucinda. So then Nesties leaves Manya with the 3 babies. And Manya names one of the other babies Ruby and the other one Martha. So they've finished the story. And Circe asks Jacob, she's like, "Why didn't my mothers grow up in the dead woods like all the other witches of the dead woods?" And Jacob told her that Manya had sent them away. There was a lot more to the story. Now back at the fairy council meeting, the fairy godmother had started the meeting, and she was like, "We are here to discuss the very important matter of the Odd Sisters." And then Nanny speaks up and she's like, "Yes, and we should definitely call for Oberon and his tree lords as soon as possible, and anyone else that's willing to fight at our side." Then the fairy godmother read the charges against the Odd Sisters. She says, "Charge 1, Snow White. The Odd Sisters tormented the poor girl and drove her mother mad, encouraging her to murder Snow. Thank goodness she only succeeded in putting her to sleep. And they gave Snow White a mirror with the ghost of Grimhilda trapped within. And if that's not enough, they are still invading the girl's dreams after all these years. Charge number 2, Belle. The sisters encouraged Circe to curse the poor beast, the misunderstood creature that he was, and his entire household. But Belle was the real victim. They cast devious spells to send poor Belle into the woods to be devoured by wolves. Charge number 3, Ariel. They plotted with Ursula to kill Ariel, not to mention their plans to take Triton off the throne, and they almost succeeded in killing Prince Eric. Charge number 4, Aurora. They helped Maleficent by means of dark magic to create Aurora. And though they all loved her, what if she had taken after her mother? That was completely irresponsible of them and put a future princess, in danger. Charge number 5, Rapunzel. They colluded with and helped that horrid baby-snatching witch Gothel to conceal Rapunzel's whereabouts from her broken-hearted and worried family. So these were the charges against the Odd Sisters that would be brought up against them, if they all survived their coming attack that they all knew was about to happen. Now, after all the formalities of this meeting, an argument started up between Nanny and the fairy godmother. They had some disagreements over who the fairies should be taking on as charges. Just princesses, or should it be all kinds of people? Now, during this argument, it came out that Nanny's first case was the Odd Sisters. And it being her first case, of course, she made some mistakes, but she followed the protocol, which was to give them to a royal family when the babies were brought to her. And the whites were perfectly happy to take them. And whatever these mistakes that Nanny made, they weren't specific about what she had done exactly, the fairy godmother still held it against Nanny. But as they're arguing, Oberon shows up. And he tells them that, in fact, the Odd Sisters had risen Maleficent from the dead. And Maleficent, in her dragon form, was on her way to the fairylands to destroy it. They needed to, get it together so that they could defend the land. They also needed to protect the witches that were back at the Dead Woods. Now, back at the Dead Woods, Snow White was going through one of Lucinda's journals, and she came across a bunch of odd cryptid notes. There was a list of names with little notes under each name. It listed Maleficent, Ursula, Nanny, Tulip, Oberon, Rock Giant, Popinjay, Grimhilda in the Mirror, the Fairies, Primrose and Hazel, Jacob, and Mrs. Tittlebottom. Then there was written down a teacup spell, and it said, "The teacups must be touched by the lips of the victim, else the spell will not be as effective. Drink from the teacup and learn their secrets. Break the teacup, and they will be broken beyond repair. Fill the cup with water and the eye of an egg, and you will see them. Fill the cup with what frightens them most, and give them nightmares. Bury the cup in cemetery dirt to suffocate them. Fill the cup with their blood, mingled with your own to control them. Throw the cup into fire to send them to Hades. Toss it into the sea to give their soul to the sea witch." Then there was a list called Objects of Our Desire. Now in the book, there's an illustration of these objects. Each one, they did a little doodle and then wrote what it was about. So we have Ursula's seashell necklace, and next to it says power. Then there's some earrings, I think, and it says insanity. Then there's like a brooch, and it says heartbreak. Then there's these earrings right here, and it says break the sisters' bond. And it's interesting because these earrings that there's a little illustration of are the same earrings that Gothel is wearing on this book cover from the last book we did. Then there's these, I'm not sure if these are earrings or like cufflinks, but it says envy. There's another pair of earrings, it says madness. There's an illustration of the magic mirror, and it says insecurity. Then there's like a tribal mask, and it says Shadow Man. And then there's this little, I can't tell what that is, this little doodle, and it says he has his own will. Then after all of that, it says Snow White, and there's these bullet points under her name. And they say, terrible girl, daughter of our cousin King White. She will take from us what we cherish most. Must kill her. Visit the queen. Take the brat to the woods. Drive Grimhilda mad. Drive her to kill Snow. Protected by Grimhilda. Plague her dreams. Destroy her bond with Grimhilda. Use Circe. Snow White's looking at all this in Lucinda's journal, and all of a sudden she hears her mother's voice. And she looks around and she sees her mother's face in a mirror that's on the wall on the other side of the room. And her mother warns her that the Odd Sisters are on their way there. She tells Snow White that they had always hated her, that they had used her, Grimhilda, to try and get at Snow White, but they had failed. She also told Snow White that the Odd Sisters had foreseen that Snow White and Circe would become close, and that's why they hated her. Then the glass in the mirror that she's talking to her mother in explodes. Snow White, she puts her arms over her face to protect herself. And when she lowers her arms, she sees her mother lying at her feet. Then Cersei, Primrose, and Hazel come running into the room, having heard all the commotion. Then, crawling out of the frame of where the mirror had been, are these terrible looking contorted creatures. They crawl through the frame, and then they stretch themselves out to full stature, and it's the Odd Sisters. And they look at Cersei, Hazel, and Primrose, and they're like, "Excuse me, we would like to be alone with Snow White and her mother." And Snow White screams, "What have you done with my mother?" And the Odd Sisters are like, "Oh, look how strong and brave." They're like, "Are you sure you really want us to save your mother? Do you really want to go back to your lands with her and have her always watching you from behind the mirror? Do you really want to live the rest of your life with the woman who tried to kill you?" And Snow White's like, "You made her do that. I know the truth." And Lucinda's like, "Oh, she has found her hate at last," referring to Snow White. And Snow White's, "You shut your mouth. My mother loves me." And the Odd Sister's like, "Oh yes, she does love you. She loves you so very much. She trapped Maleficent's bird Opal for us, gave her to us against her will, and then we were able to use it to lure Maleficent from beyond the veil and resurrect her in her dragon form. In fact, she loves you so much, she conspired with Flanzy to help her wake us from the dreamscape, and she did it all for you. She's been plotting and scheming with us this whole time without a care for who lives or dies in the process." Then Lucinda grabbed Snow White by the throat and began to choke her. And Cersei screams at Snow White to drink from the little locket that was around her neck that Cersei had given her earlier. Then Lucinda hears her own sisters behind her choking. She drops Snow White and she turns to Cersei and she's like, "Are you doing this?" Now inside the locket was a little bit of Cersei's blood. And Lucinda screams. She's like, "How dare you? How dare you give her a little bit of your blood, our blood?" Then she turns to Snow White and she's like, "You can't have her. You can't have our Cersei." Then Jacob walks into the room and he's like, "Girls," he's like, "you stop this at once. You are too much like your mother and grandmother." And all three of the Odd Sisters lock eyes on him. And there's something about him that kind of soothes them as he's talking to them. He tells them to calm down and everything's okay. But then they snapped out of it, and Lucinda's like, she's like, "Don't speak to me about my mother and grandmother." She's like, "They sent us away. They sent us off to live with the fairies and they gave us to the one of legends." And she's like, "And you know, that's how she got that name, don't you?" She's like, "Because we were her charges, not because she was some great fairy." And Jacob is like, he's like, "We didn't want to send you away. It wasn't up to us. We wanted to keep you. Sending you away was the last thing we wanted to do after Nesties made you into three." Now, while the Odd Sisters were distracted by their father, Hazel took Snow White by the hand and led her out of the room and took her back to the safety of the Odd Sisters' house, which doesn't sound like the safest place. The house of the one who hates you the most. But because Cersei had put the enchantment on it, they felt it was the safest place for her. Jacob tells them that their grandmother had wanted to extend her reign beyond the boundaries of the Dead Woods, just like they were trying to do. She wanted the whole world to be black, and she wanted to unleash her dead minions upon the many kingdoms. But the ancestors stopped her and forced their mother, Manya, to give them to the fairies. The ancestors had convinced them that that was the only and best choice for them. And Lucinda was like, well, why didn't you fight for us to stay here? And Jacob was like, well, we did, but we believed the ancestors when they said this was the best thing for you. And, you know, we also kind of feared disappointing them, but we should have. We should have kept you here so that you would have ruled after your mother, not Gothel. And then Ruby was like, well, why didn't you tell us all this when we came and visited here, you know, in the last book? And Jacob was like, well, again, one, we believed the ancestors, plus by then I was bound to Gothel and to keep her secrets as Queen of the Dead. Now Cersei's listening to all of this, and things were starting to make a little more sense to her. It made sense that her mothers would have wanted to create a daughter in the same fashion that their mother had. But they must have gotten it wrong or something. They must have given too much of themselves. Then Martha asks Jacob, she's like, what do you mean when you said she made us into three? And Ruby, she looks at Lucinda and she's like, yeah, what does he mean by that? So Lucinda decides to tell them the truth, and she looks at them and she's like, my sisters, she's like, I was born of Manya and Jacob's love. But then our grandmother created a spell that made us into three, which resulted in the creation of you two. She's like, you know, like in the same way that we created Cersei, in the same way that we helped Maleficent create Aurora. She's like, you don't get it? Now by this time, Hazel had come back into the room and she had overheard this last part of the conversation. And she says to the odd sister, she's like, you know, you took our mother's spell and you changed it, you messed it up. If you hadn't tampered with it, none of this would have happened. But instead, you took her spell and you turned it into something destructive, just like you always do with everything. And Lucinda yells back, she's like, it wasn't our fault, it was just a miscalculation. That's why it rebounded on Maleficent. And Hazel's like, yeah, just like it did on you. Everyone sees it, even Cersei sees it. The only ones who don't see it is you. She's like, don't destroy everyone that your daughter loves just to keep her close to you. She's like, with every life that you destroy, you're punishing your own daughter. And the odd sisters start screaming and crying. They're like, no, it's not a punishment. We didn't do all this to punish her. She's our light. We need her close to us. The farther away she is, the less clearly we can see. We need our light. Without her, we're in the darkness and we're all alone. Then Cersei speaks up and she's like, I'm here, mother. She's like, nobody can take me away from you. But in her mind, she's thinking, oh dear, she's like, I don't think I want to live a life by their side. And she's thinking again about what she knows she has to do. Lucinda starts screaming. She's like, no. She's like, we will have our Cersei. We will rip everyone away from her that she holds dear. And then all three of the odd sisters, lightning starts shooting out of their hands, and they start striking the walls of the mansion and bringing to life all the decorative, like, night creatures that had decorated the walls. The creatures break free and they start crashing through the picture windows, and Lucinda screams. She's like, night creatures, do my bidding. She's like, go to the fairylands and destroy my enemies in my name. And everyone, they all run to the windows and they look outside, and the creatures are all outside, and they look up in the sky and there's stone dragons circling the dead woods. And then they see a spiral of light at the the boundary of the dead woods that all these creatures were going to walk through in order to get to the fairylands and destroy everything. And Circe, she closes her eyes and she knows what she has to do, but it wasn't until this moment that she had the courage to do it. Back in the fairylands, Oberon and his tree lords and all the fairies had assembled for this great war that Oberon should have foreseen between the witches and the fairies. And he also prayed to the gods of nature to protect Circe, since he couldn't afford to spare any of his soldiers and send them there to help her. He was also very thankful to Opal, who had come to him with the Odd Sisters' plan. She had escaped from Grimhilda and came to him, and he knew that it must have broken Opal's heart to betray her mistress, Maleficent. But her loyalties were now with a new witch, one with a purer heart. That was Circe. Then he looks up into the sky and he sees a dragon, and its body was plummeting to the earth. The Odd Sisters had resurrected Maleficent just for her to die another painful death. And Oberon knew what Circe must have done in order for this to happen and save them all. And what she had done was sacrifice herself. She took a piece of the broken mirror and stabbed herself in the heart. She had no choice. It was the only way to give her mothers back the best parts of them, to make them whole again. And the last thing that she saw before she closed her eyes were the horrified looks on her mother's faces. Then Snow White, Hazel, and Primrose came running back into the room. They see Circe dead, and they see the Odd Sisters motionless on the floor, though they're still breathing. And Jacob's like, Circe saved us all by giving them back the best parts of themselves. He's like, but I don't know why the sisters won't wake up. Then he realizes that, they just don't want to live in a world without their daughter. They all hear an ethereal voice say, this isn't how it's supposed to end. It was the ancestors. And they were like, Circe shouldn't have to die for our mistakes, and neither should her mothers. They will have a chance to change things, but it will be a choice that they have to make together in the place between. The end. So yeah, that was a very interesting story. I had been very curious as to what these Odd Sisters' motivation was so far in this entire series. I mean, I knew they hated Snow White, but we didn't really know why. Now we know. They knew that she was going to steal their daughter away from them. Like I said earlier, all of the women in this story, which is basically all women, we see very few princes or kings in these stories, but all the women are very possessive of each other, like sisters and mothers and daughters and even friends. They're always all upset because they got another friend or something. And I guess there are women like that. So here are some of my questions. So I guess Gothel was Manya's second child after Lucinda. I guess she had another baby when the Odd Sisters were sent away. Also, how did Opal know about the Odd Sisters' plans to resurrect Maleficent, unless, Grimhilda had just spilt the beans while Opal was in her possession? Anyway, I think the overall lesson of this story and was what Mrs. Tittlebottom had said, to not get too wrapped up in someone else's story or someone else's life. Don't forget about your own story and your own goals and dreams. Don't forget to write your own fairy tale. So yeah, that is the backstory of the Odd Sisters. The Odd Sisters only exist in this series as far as I know. They're not in any of the movies. They're just kind of the explanation, I think, as to why all these things happened throughout the movies and as a way to tie them all together. If you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It's how I know what kind of videos to make, what to spend my time on. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss when I do the other books in this series. I think we have 4 more to go. Yes, I think so. So yeah, that will be coming up along with some other Disney books and some other fairy tales. It's gonna be fun. So make sure and subscribe so you don't miss out. And remember, write your own fairy tale. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. When you first open the book, there is an illustration of the map. So this book starts out with Cersei narrating. So this book starts out with Cersei narrating. But little did they know that Ursula had actually kidnapped Cersei and put